Well, Fonzie, thank you very much for those kind words of welcome. It's a great privilege to me to be here speaking to you tonight. And it is indeed the feast of St. Julian. Unfortunately, back in the 1950s, when the Roman calendar was being revised, it was decided that he never existed, and he was one of the saints that were obliterated from the calendar. But he's still my name day. And so, Cardinal Nicholas Wiseman died in 1865. It's hard to believe that it's a whole 10 years since we celebrated the 150th anniversary. He was one of the leading Catholic scholars of his day. He played a key role in the re-establishment of the Catholic Church in England and Wales. And I should say that I use the terms Catholic and Protestant as shorthand for Roman Catholic and Anglican, or Church of England, rather than any doctrinal point scoring. He was the first de facto head of the Catholic Church in England and the first cardinal to serve in England since the Reformation. Now, Thomas Weld had been appointed a cardinal in 1830, but he never left Italy, living in opulent style in Rome. On his death in 1837, it was Wiseman who preached his funeral oration, and Charles Acton was also appointed cardinal in 1842 at the age of 39, but he never visited England either. He died 5 years later, not living in opulent style in Rome, but ministering to the poor of Naples. Wiseman also had strong family links with South Kilkenny and Waterford, as you shall hear. Inevitably, much has been written about his career. In particular, he was the subject of a 2-volume biography by Wilfrid Ward, published in 1897. In compiling this lecture, I've used, in addition to my own researches, the entries on Wiseman in the original Dictionary of National Biography, 1900, and the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, 2004, as well as a variety of internet and printed sources. I also owe a particular debt to 3 people: Dan Dowling of Glenmore, whose article on the Wiseman and strange families appeared in the Old Kilkenny Review in 1974, Anthony Brophy, whose article on Wiseman appeared in the Christmas supplement of the Munster Express in 2012, and above all, Dr. Martin Murphy of Oxford, whose knowledge of Irish and English Catholic families in Spain during this period is encyclopedic. Now, according to Wilfrid Ward, the Cardinal claims descent from Capel Wiseman, Protestant Bishop of Dromore in County Down, who died in 1694 and who belonged to an illustrious English family of Wiseman baronets. And apparently, after the Cardinal's death, Rear Admiral Sir William Saltonstall Wiseman, 8th Bart, then Commander-in-Chief of the Australia Station, Royal Navy, attended a requiem mass for him in Sydney Cathedral. Well, I am very, very sceptical about all this. For one thing, Bishop Capel Wiseman never married. The Wisemans would be neither the first nor the last family to fantasize about illustrious ancestry. Wiseman is actually not an uncommon name, and in our own time, Ernest Wiseman, the son of a railway lampman in Leeds, achieved fame as Ernie Wise, one half of the duo Morecambe and Wise. There have been Wisemans in Ireland since the 13th century, especially in County Cork, and I think the Cardinal belonged to one of these families. Whatever about their origins, during the 18th century, the Cardinal's family were merchants in Waterford. Now, the Catholic merchants who had once ruled the city now suffered under the penal laws, and many of the younger and more ambitious ones took advantage of the already existing commercial links with the continent to settle in France and Spain. Their Mecca was the province of Andalusia, particularly the city of Cadiz. Here, many had successful careers and some made fortunes. If you go to the Waterford Museum of Silver, you will see a display of some of the silver that they sent back from Spain to be used in their native churches in Waterford. In 1979, I spent 3 weeks in Cadiz researching Waterford families. It was my second visit there, but the first that I had made on my own. Dumped in the centre of Seville, off the bus from the airport, I was wandering around looking for a place to spend the night before continuing to Cadiz next day by train, when, to my astonishment, my eye lighted on a plaque. The inscription translates, "On the 2nd of August, 1802, there was born in this house Cardinal Wiseman, Archbishop of Westminster, luminary of the Catholic priesthood and an honour to his country. The most excellent city council had this stone placed here to preserve the memory of so illustrious a son of Seville, 1865. It was erected after the Cardinal's death, and it contains a small error of fact, as you shall hear. The Cardinal stated that it was his grandfather, James Wiseman, who left Waterford and settled in Seville, accompanied by his sons, James and Patrick. James Jr., the Cardinal's father, kept a journal, now in the Vatican archives, of the main events of his life, of births, marriages and deaths in particular. And according to this, they left Waterford in 1771 and eventually arrived in Seville in 1779. What on earth did young men like him make of their new abode? Having left drizzly Waterford, they now found themselves in the sun-drenched capital of the old Moorish kingdom. Moreover, the future Cardinal's home was in the Barrio de Santa Cruz, the very heart of the city, within easy reach of the world's largest cathedral, the Ayuntamiento, or City Hall, and the Alcázares Reales, the magnificent palace of the Moorish kings. I'm often asked what exactly the Irish merchants in Spain traded in. The answer is anything that made money. The firm of Wiseman and Sons turned their hands to various enterprises, including, would you believe, the processing of licorice. Why? Because it was much used as a flavouring agent in tobacco and beer, as well as a form of confectionery. They also went into banking and acted as bankers for English travellers and grandees. The famous socialite Lady Holland, visiting Seville with her husband, described the Wisemans in her diary as paddies of the grave sort. Well, the Wiseman firm flourished, and in 1781, James Jr. married a young lady named Mariana Dunphy, or O'Donoghue. Her father is alleged to have been a Spanish general. He was not. The father described himself in his will as vecino y del comercio de Sevilla, a citizen and merchant of Seville. It was her brother who was the general, and he was a very important one too. Juan O'Donoghue, the future Cardinal's half-brother-in-law, fought with distinction in the war against Napoleon, and during the heady years of liberal government that followed, he was appointed Captain General of Andalusia, and in 1821, Viceroy of New Spain. A committed liberal, he arrived at Veracruz with the mission of negotiating a form of home rule between the Spanish government and the rebellious Mexicans. By his tact and persistence, he succeeded in getting the rebels on side, persuading the Spanish troops to withdraw, and setting up a provisional government. Having achieved an almost impossible mission, in a mere 2.5 months, he died of pleurisy. And what about his surname? Before he left Spain for Mexico, Juan was made a Knight of Carlos III. This order had been initiated back in 1771. Carlos III was an enlightened and intelligent reforming monarch, and the order was only granted to those who'd done something of benefit to Spain. It was not awarded to mere aristocratic knotheads. The official requirements for being a knight were: he should be loyal to the king and to the Catholic Church, should believe in the mystery of the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin, should receive Holy Communion at least once a year, and, more important from our point of view, he should prove his ancestors were of pure and noble blood, back at least as far as his great-grandparents. Well, the Irish merchants who settled in Spain may well have had among their ancestors no Jews, Protestants or manual labourers, as required for certification, but they certainly weren't of noble blood. However, they had to claim they were, and who in Spain was in a position to check whether there really was, for instance, a Prince of Ballymaclattery? Well, O'Donoghue proudly claimed his father had been a native of Glanflesk. Why? Because the title of the chief of the O'Donoghue clan is Prince of Glanflesk, which is near Killarney. In his will, however, his father states that he is a native of Callan, County Kilkenny. And in his journal, he uses the form Dunphy, not O'Donoghue, because that's the Kilkenny form of the Gaelic O'Donoghue. The general's 4 great-grandfathers were, in fact, James Dunphy of Callan, Patrick Roth of Kilkenny, Philip Ryan of Inch, near Thurles, and Edmund Birmingham of Carrick. So, don't forget, this remarkable man, General O'Donoghue, was a son of County Kilkenny, and don't let those mendacious Kerry-men claim them as one of their own. So, James Wiseman and his wife Mariana, Dunphy or O'Donoghue, had 3 daughters, plus one who died as an infant. In 1791, their father records that he had them inoculated against smallpox. For this, a Dr. Hearn had to come out from Cadiz, and Wiseman had to fork out for the doctor's professional services 3,200 reales de Villon, plus another 360 for the doctor's travel expenses, and 195 as a fan, as a present for his wife. It was pretty expensive being inoculated against smallpox in Spain in 1791. 2 years later, James Wiseman noted in his diary, "My beloved wife, Mary Ann Dunphy, departed this life at 1:30 o'clock in the morning. She was taken with a sudden spitting and evacuation of blood that carried her off suddenly. May her soul rest in peace." She was buried in the beautiful church of San Isidoro. Merchants such as Wiseman occasionally had to make business trips to foreign parts, which could involve long absences. During one such trip, in the mid-1790s, James left his children in Ireland, and in 1799 he departed for England, leaving the children in London, where the second girl, Elena, died and was buried in St. Pancras. On the 19th of April, 1800, still in England, Wiseman married for a second time in St. Peter and Paul's Church in London. His wife was Chavaria Strange. There's a beautiful miniature portrait of her in Waterford Museum of Treasures. Chavaria was the daughter of Peter Strange of Aylwardstown near Glenmore. She was born in 1773 and baptised in the Great Chapel in Baronstrand Street. Her ancestors had been settled in the Waterford area for many generations. The surname Strange is also written Strang and Strong in the old records, and it means strong man. From at least the 15th century down to the time of Cromwell, the Stranges had been one of the old Catholic families that ruled Waterford, and their name crops up in many lists of mayors, sheriffs and freemen. They also had small landed estates in County Kilkenny. One branch settled at Dunkit and the other at Drumdowney, the southeast tip of the county, opposite Cheek Point and Great Island. They were all swept away by the Cromwellian confiscations. And now to the strange connection with Aylwardstown. This place, of course, is named after the Aylward family, who in 1609 built a tower house on their land. The Aylwards, like the Stranges, lost their estate under Cromwell, but they made a dramatic comeback when Peter Aylward took the soup, conformed to the established church, and was one of the lucky few who got his estates back. He married the daughter and heiress of Sir Richard Butler of Paulstown and went to live at Shankill Castle in a different part of the county. Aylwardstown he bequeathed to his daughter, the wife of Lawrence Strange. Thus the Stranges came to Aylwardstown, where they built a comfortable dwelling house onto the old castle of the Aylwards. In 1801, While still in London, James Wiseman and Cavaria Strange had a son also named James. In March of the following year, James, Cavaria, the two surviving daughters of James's first marriage, and their infant son set off for Seville, where they arrived 2 months later. Their new home was in the house now called the Casa Fabiola, after the heroine of the Cardinal's best-selling novel. It was rented from an order of nuns, the Sisters of Santa Maria de Gracia. From here, the second daughter, Mariana, was married in July 1802 to an English merchant of Cadiz named Thomas Tucker. More of the Tuckers later on. The next entry in James Wiseman's diary reads, "On the morning of the 3rd of August 1802, half an hour past midnight, my wife Javiera was delivered of a son, who was baptized the following day by the names of Nicholas Patricio Esteban, my brother Pat, sponsor by proxy." The original church of Santa Cruz, alas, was destroyed in 1811. 2 years later, the Wiseman family was saddened by the death of Alicia, the youngest daughter by James's first marriage. Her father wrote in his journal, "My beloved daughter Alicia departed this life after an attack of 36 hours of bilious vomiting, which terminated in convulsive fits." They loved writing these gory details in their diaries, so I hope your dinner is well digested at this stage. However, 4 months later, their joy was renewed when Cavaria gave birth to a daughter, christened Francisca, but always known by her nickname Frasquita. On the 2nd of January, 1805, the Wisemans and Tuckers assembled to celebrate Mariana's 19th birthday. Cavaria later wrote in her husband's diary, "James Wiseman," that's her husband, "was seized with an apoplectic fit, which in a few hours deprived him of life, leaving an afflicted widow and 3 small children to deplore their loss for the best and tenderest of husbands and the fondest and most affectionate of parents. May his soul find mercy from his Creator, who was pleased to cut him off in so sudden and unexpected manner, and may the charity and humanity which he showed every person in distress find merit in the sight of the Almighty, who disposes everything in this life for his honour and glory." He was buried with his first wife and their children. The Wisemans and the Tuckers could have stayed on in Seville, but Spain was now embroiled in the Napoleonic Wars. At this stage, it was an ally of France and fighting against Britain. The result of that was the destruction of their combined fleets at the Battle of Trafalgar. It made sense to head for home, while James's brother Patrick was left to continue the firm and occupy the house in Seville. The nuns did not find him a satisfactory tenant, complaining that he had damaged the fabric of their house by keeping hens on the roof and building a hen house there. When the French, who are now at war with Spain, occupied Seville, Patrick moved to London. He later died in Madrid. Now, I can never resist a good red herring. So before going on with the Wisemans, I want to take a look at the Tuckers, descendants by James Wiseman's first marriage. They settled in Sussex, and 3 years after their arrival, Cavaria wrote in her late husband's diary, more gory details coming up, "Mariana, the wife of Mr. Tucker, was suddenly taken ill on the 25th of March with violent convulsions, which terminated her existence in the space of 12 hours, she being in the 7th month of her pregnancy. An operation was performed to extract the infant, which was already dead, in hopes of saving the life of the unfortunate mother, but without effect. May the Lord have mercy on her soul." The Tuckers had one daughter named Fanny Xaviera, who married William Burke, the owner of a small landed estate in the west of Ireland. 4 of their children made names for themselves in various ways. The eldest son, Thomas Henry Burke, rose through the ranks of the Irish civil service, right to the top, being appointed permanent Under-Secretary for Ireland. That's to say, head of the civil service with responsibility for carrying out the policies of the UK government in this country. It was not a good time to be in this job. The land war was at its height, and Burke, known as the Castle Rat, was far from popular. On the afternoon of the 6th of May, 1882, he was driving in his coach through Phoenix Park to the Viceregal Lodge when he encountered Lord Frederick Cavendish, who had just been sworn in at Dublin Castle as Chief Secretary. He got out of his carriage and was walking with Cavendish towards the lodge when he was assailed by a band of desperadoes armed with surgical knives. When Cavendish went to his aid, he too was attacked, and the pair were stabbed repeatedly in chest and neck. The Phoenix Park murders were not only an act of savage brutality, they were a disaster for Ireland, dismaying our friends in England, such as we had, and providing ready ammunition for our enemies. Punch carried a celebrated cartoon in which Parnell is depicted as the Irish Frankenstein who's created a monster that he can't control. As a quick aside, a few years ago we met a gentleman named Brian Garland and brought him to Lismore for a lecture in the castle at which the Duke of Devonshire was present, and I was able to introduce Mr. Garland to the Duke, saying, by the way, this man's great-great-grandfather assassinated your great-great-great-uncle. And I left them to it, and they got on quite well. In 1884, on the death of a cousin, the second Burke brother became head of the family. The youngest brother, Augustus, and his sister Dorothy became well-known artists. After the Phoenix Park murders, Augustus settled in England, where he tried to present a more favourable image of the Irish, such romanticised portraits of girls clad in lovely shawls and so on. Now, back to the Wisemans. Cavaria, meanwhile, had returned to Elbertstown House with her 3 children, James, that's the third one, Nicholas and Frasquita. They must have found the Kilkenny countryside quite a shock after Seville. Nicholas later admitted he arrived in this country not knowing 10 words of English. In 1808, the 2 boys were sent to a private boarding school in Waterford, and then, in 1810, they were enrolled at St. Cuthbert's College at Ushaw in Bleak, County Durham. This was Nicholas's second life-changing experience, and he was still only 8. Dr. Martin Murphy speculates as to how Nicholas's life might have developed if he had stayed in Spain. We may well wonder what sort of Irishman he would have become had he stayed at Elbertstown. From now on, however, his life would be centred on England and Rome. His brother James returned to Spain and joined his uncle Patrick in Madrid. Frasquita married an Italian count and went to live at Fano on the Adriatic coast. And here she was joined by her mother, Cavaria, who ended her days at Fano in 1851, having just lived long enough to see her second son elevated to the rank of cardinal. St. Cuthbert's College, Ushaw, was a reincarnation of the English college at Douai, whose inhabitants had been forced to flee from France during the Reign of Terror. Opened in 1808, it sought pupils from families of class in England and Ireland, hence the arrival of the Wiseman boys in 1810. Nicholas was, by his own admission, a quiet, non-athletic youth, often with a book as his only companion. I wonder had he any Kilkenny blood in him at all. Now, we're well used to the idea of the Catholic Church in Ireland as being the religion of the masses, ground down by repressive penal laws from which they liberated themselves under the heroic leadership of Daniel O'Connell. The situation in England was quite different. At this time, the Catholic Church in England consisted mainly of a small number of aristocratic and gentry families together with their servants and tenants. They were proud of their ancestors, who'd suffered vicious persecution on account of their faith. They were now concerned to live quietly, keep out of trouble, and discreetly seek for greater toleration. They saw their national history in a mirror. Everything was back to front. For them, Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth, Drake, Raleigh, Cecil, Cromwell were not heroes at all. They were the persecutors of the true faith. Politically, they were allied to the liberal Whig tradition and to the Enlightenment. Their leaders believed that human beings are basically good and that reason will triumph over emotion. A noble ideal, but unfortunately it isn't true and it doesn't work. One of these leaders was John Lingard, President of Ushaw, a quiet, gentle priest, writer of the hymn, Hail, Holy Queen, the Ocean's Star. He was also the author of a multi-volume history of England in which he sought, by painstaking use of primary sources, to convince his readers of the truth of the Catholic faith and the disastrous effects of the Reformation. It was Wiseman's good fortune to sit at the feet of so enlightened a teacher. Moreover, Lingard soon spotted that in Wiseman he had a student of genius, and in 1818, Wiseman, still only 16 years of old, was one of 9 students sent from Ushaw to study at the English College in Rome. Like Dowey, the English College had suffered during the Napoleonic Wars, and it was now undergoing a revival. Wiseman's rise was meteoric, culminating in his appointment as president of the college in 1828. His first major work, Hore Syriace, is a study of the Syriac texts in the Vatican Library, in which some of the earliest versions of the Old Testament are written. I haven't read it, I'm afraid. He became professor of Oriental languages in the Roman University. He lectured on the theology of the Eucharist. He was appointed special preacher for the many English visitors to Rome, and this position made him increasingly aware of the Catholic movement then developing within the Church of England. The 19th century saw great advances in science, but many Christians worried that science, based exclusively on reason, would disprove faith-based religion. In a course of lectures, Wiseman argued that the two are compatible. As the century progressed and the conflict between the two sides became more embittered, a rather fierce American scientist named Andrew Dixon White singled out Wiseman for praise in his book, A History of the Warfare Between Science and Theology in Christendom. He writes, "It's a duty and a pleasure to state that here one great Christian scholar did honour to religion and to himself by quietly accepting the claims of science and making the best of them. That man was Nicholas Wiseman, better known afterwards as Cardinal Wiseman. The conduct of this pillar of the Roman Church contrasts admirably with that of the timid Protestants who are filling England with shrieks and denunciations." In 1835, Wiseman revisited England, staying for more than a year. He gave public lectures on Christian doctrine and, together with Daniel O'Connell, founded a Catholic periodical, the Dublin Review. He also managed a brief visit to his relations in Elwardstown before returning to Rome. At this time, there was no Catholic hierarchy in England. The country was divided into a number of provinces, each in the charge of a vicar general, whose job was to report back to the Pope, but who had no local authority. There were bishops only in name, being given the title of some obscure diocese in foreign parts, where there were probably few, if any, Catholics. In 1840, Wiseman returned to England with the exotic title of Bishop of Melipotamus. He was also appointed president of St Mary's College, Oscott, near Birmingham. In 1846, a new pope was elected, Pius IX, at 54, a mere youngster by papal standards. Keen to make a fresh start, he was anxious, among other things, to build bridges with non-Catholic powers. He commissioned Wiseman to convince Lord Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary, of the reforms he was instituting in the Papal States. And remember, the Pope at this time ruled most of Central Europe. Central Italy. They weren't very far-reaching reforms. He banned the use of torture in the Vatican prisons. He allowed the building of railways in the Papal States, hitherto regarded as the work of the devil. But then, in 1848, everything changed. Europe was convulsed by revolutions. Even in Ireland, we had the Battle of the Widow McCormack's Cabbage Patch. And in Rome, a republic was declared, and the Pope had to flee for his life. Well, the republic was soon crushed with the aid of Austrian troops, and the Pope returned. Now, however, convinced that liberalism was a very bad thing. During the rest of his reign, the longest in papal history, he became increasingly intransigent. Deprived eventually of all his political powers, he refused to recognize the new Italian state and remained the self-styled prisoner of the Vatican. In 1864, he published a list of propositions, which you might think to be quite reasonable. The Catholic religion need no longer be regarded as the only religion of the state. Protestantism is just as pleasing to God as Catholicism. The Church should be separate from the state. Everyone should be free to profess whatever religion they are led to by the light of reason. The Pope can and ought to reconcile himself with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. Yet, these are beliefs which the Catholics were now banned from holding on pain of eternal damnation. Inevitably, such increasing conservatism had its effect on the re-emerging Catholic Church in England. And that church was in process of being reformed, partly by the conversion of some leading aristocrats and intellectuals, but even more by the arrival of hordes of starving Irish fleeing the Great Famine and its aftermath. In 1780, there had been about 80,000 Catholics in England. There were now 750,000. The state-supported Church of England, by contrast, was seen as decadent and sterile. Committed Anglicans opted either for a simpler, more Protestant form of worship, or a revival of the Catholic modes which had been discarded at the Reformation. These Anglo-Catholics, or Tractarians as they were called, because they publicised their views in a series of tracts or pamphlets, were led by a group of scholars at Oxford University. Already embroiled in controversy with the established church, the Oxford movement suffered a catastrophic blow when some of its leaders decided to go the whole hog and join the Church of Rome. The most prominent of these were John Henry Newman, received into the church by Wiseman at Oscott, followed in 1851 by Henry Manning. Both men would one day be made cardinals, and Manning was destined to be Wiseman's successor. The new militancy in the English Church is summed up in the hymn Faith of Our Fathers. Catholics looked back with pride on the noble example set by the martyrs of the Reformation period. Our fathers, chained in prisons dark, were still in heart and conscience free. How sweet would be their children's fate if they, like them, could die for thee. And they also looked forward to a time when England would be Catholic again. Faith of our fathers, Mary's prayers shall win our country back to thee. And through the truth that comes from God, England shall then indeed be free. Many of you will be familiar with the Irish version of the hymn, which used to be sung at GAA matches along with the national anthem. For some years now, the more militant English Catholics had been campaigning for the restoration of a full hierarchy, with real bishops and real dioceses. Progress had been interrupted by the events of 1848. Now, the Pope decided to go ahead, and the most obvious person to head the new establishment was Wiseman. He was summoned to Rome and informed that he was to be made a cardinal and Archbishop of Westminster. Before leaving Rome, Wiseman issued an exuberant pastoral letter entitled From Out the Flaminian Gate. The Flaminian Gate is part of the city wall which in Wiseman's day still marked the city limits. From here, he would head north along the Via Flaminia to England. To quote the historian Dennis Sewell, he did not feel that an excessive discretion should spoil a moment of such significance. His pastoral letter read like a magnificent fanfare, culminating in a great clash of cymbals. It was a result in an equally noisy clash of cultures. Its triumphalist language gave the impression that Rome was about to set about the conquest of England. It was greeted by a storm of outrage. The Times accused the Pope of plotting a takeover. Queen Victoria, no friend of the Church of Rome, snapped peevishly, "Am I Queen of England or am I not?" And the Earl of Winchelsea, one of England's doughtier peers, demanded that the government immediately declare war on the Papal States. On his arrival in England, Wiseman published in the national newspapers an appeal to the reason and good feeling of the English people. He reassured his readers that he had been speaking in spiritual terms, not political ones, and that he had no designs on the wealth and pomp of Westminster Abbey, being more concerned with the plight of the poor who thronged the streets outside. The Anglican bishops were considerably miffed by this display of moral one-upmanship, and the Times, also determined not to be upstaged, accused Rome of being not only arrogant but devious as well. But the appeal did the trick. Public opinion was appeased. This was Wiseman at his best. In 1852, Wiseman summoned a pastoral council at which the arrangements he'd thought out for organising his diocese were enthusiastically accepted. The star of the occasion, however, was John Henry Newman. In his sermon, published under the title "The Second Spring," Newman painted a glowing picture of the end of the winter of persecution and the impending return of England, Mary's bower, to the Catholic faith. It was so moving that Cardinal Wiseman wept throughout. Of course, it didn't happen. There were no mass conversions. The Church of England survived. The Tractarians found new leaders. Catholics remained at best tolerated, at worst attacked verbally or even physically. There was no shortage of 19th century Ian Paisleys to whip up Romophobic fury among the working classes. Even today, though Catholic and Protestant mobs no longer battle it out in the streets of Liverpool, a subtle discrimination remains. Britain still cannot have a Catholic monarch, has never had a Catholic Prime Minister, and to my knowledge, the BBC has never run a series on the Catholic martyrs. In Dennis Sewell's words, Newman's second spring turned out to be merely a sunny spell. One of Wiseman's ablest opponents at the time was the Reverend Charles Kingsley. Now, Kingsley was no ignorant bigot. He was an evangelical clergyman with a fierce commitment to social justice. He stood for a sturdy, muscular band of Christianity, and he had no truck with weird ceremonies led by fellows dressed in women's clothes. A brilliant writer, his novel, Westward Ho, in which the heroic English Protestants trounced the evil Catholic Spaniards on the high seas, was so successful that a new village in Devon was named after it, the only town in these islands to have an exclamation mark in its name. His best-selling children's story, The Water Babies, alerted English readers to the cruelty of sending small boys up chimneys. It's also about the moral education of a boy to the point where he's able to confront his old tormentor, Grimes the chimney sweep, and forgive him. Unfortunately, Kingsley was a strong supporter not only of Darwin's theory of the origin of species, but of what is known as social Darwinism. If we're all descended from apes, then maybe some races have evolved further than others. Perhaps black people are not fully human at all. Kingsley's writings are gratuitously insulting to blacks, Jews, Irish and Roman Catholics. Visiting Connemara in 1860, he wrote back to his wife, "I am haunted by the human chimpanzees I saw along that 100 miles of horrible country. To see white chimpanzees is dreadful. If they were black, one wouldn't see it so much, but their skins, except where tanned by exposure, were as white as ours. In 1852, Kingsley produced a novel called Hypatia, after its heroine. Strongly anti-Catholic in tone, it portrays the early church as corrupt and debauched, and it climaxes with Hypatia being stripped naked and torn apart by monks beneath an enormous image of Christ. To counter its effects, Wiseman also wrote a novel, Fabiola, or The Church of the Catacombs. It depicts a persecuted church in which Fabiola and her friends show forgiveness, courage, and faithfulness unto death. It was also, of course, a thinly veiled reference to the plight of English Catholics during the Reformation. Its popularity was phenomenal and widespread. Unfortunately, it was not just from outside the church that Wiseman was under attack. The old English Catholics bitterly resented the intrusion into their quiet lives of the newcomers, with their blatant flaunting of Catholicism and their subservience to Rome, and who filled their churches with statues and their lives with newfangled devotions. There were clashes of personality, especially painful as they involved Wiseman's former friends. There were disagreements about funding, clerical appointments, the role of religious orders. So it was probably with some relief that Wiseman accepted in August 1858 the invitation of the Bishop of Clonfert to pay an extended visit to Ireland to preach at the opening of a new church at Ballinasloe. On his arrival in Kingstown, he was greeted with rapturous enthusiasm wherever he went. In mid-September, he arrived at Waterford Station from Kilkenny and was greeted by the mayor and a huge cheering crowd. Here he took his seat in the carriage of his kinsman, Peter Strange, and was conveyed to Aylwardstown. Crowds lined the route and followed the carriage all the way. On arrival, he celebrated Mass and spent the night in the house of his boyhood. The following day, the carriage returned to Waterford. Crowds waited all day along the bridge and quays for his arrival. A couple of miles outside the city, he was met by a procession consisting of the trade guilds of the city bearing banners, and a vast concourse of people wearing green boughs, while a band played patriotic airs. With difficulty, the carriage made its way over the bridge and down the quay to City Hall for a civic reception and banquet. 30 years later, the Stranges were gone from Aylwardstown. One of the last to die was Wiseman's cousin, Thomas Fitzgerald Strange, former mayor of Waterford, who greeted Wiseman on his arrival in Waterford. The story goes that as he lay dying in 1897, he instructed his family and friends not to carve his name on his headstone. Just put, "Here lies an honest solicitor," he told them. People will read it and say, "An honest solicitor? That's strange." In 1859, Wiseman returned to his London residence at Etlow House in Leighton, no doubt with a heavy heart, to face his third provincial council, which proved to be the bitterest and most divisive of all. Worn down by all the quarrelling and by ill health, he came more under the influence of Manning, the doctrinaire, hardliner and administrator, and less under that of Newman, the gentle and enlightened scholar. He became less liberal in his views, condemning the Association for the Promotion of the Unity of Christendom and banning Catholics from sending their sons to Oxford and Cambridge. He remained unflinching, however, in his commitment to the poor. This may be his most important achievement. It was certainly that of his successor. Cardinal Manning has had a bad press from the intellectual world, chiefly thanks to the spiteful description of him by Lytton Strachey in Eminent Victorians. Yet this grim-looking old man was unremitting in his care for London's poor, by whom he was deeply loved. Whenever Manning appeared in the street, he was immediately surrounded by a crowd of little urchins who would hold on to his clothes in his hands. Wiseman died on the 15th of February 1865, and he was buried in the Catholic section of Kingsley Green Cemetery, on the understanding that he would be eventually reinterred in Westminster Cathedral. Over 40 years later, the cathedral was at last ready, and Wiseman found his last resting place in a side chapel beneath a magnificent Gothic tomb. To conclude with the words of his latest biographer, Richard Sheafan, Wiseman expected and accepted opposition to his support for religious orders, his willingness to compromise upon non-essentials when it came to dealing with non-Catholics, and his sincere struggle to overcome disagreements not only among Catholics, but between Catholics and non-Catholics as well. He found it very difficult, however, to withstand the opposition of those from whom he had expected support. In spite of his many disappointments and the constant opposition which he experienced, it would be difficult to name anyone with the personal qualities and the background necessary to match Wiseman's achievement for the Roman Catholic Church in England. He left his mark on the character of the Catholic community as nobody else by taking advantage of developments as they arose, as well as promoting the political and social equality of Catholics with their fellow Englishmen. And of course, his roots were in Waterford and South Kilkenny, so it's fitting he should be remembered here 1.5 centuries after his death. Thank you.